Showtime.
You're live now, Senator Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Peggy. So welcome everybody, Senate Education, and we are at Thursday, April 23rd, 2020. And we have a relatively short agenda today. As I told you last time, the House Education Committee was not ready to move forward with the default budget language, so we have tabled that, perhaps indefinitely, but maybe not. But the Act 173 language they seemed fine with a couple of minor tweaks, which I believe Jim has incorporated into the new draft. So why don't we start with a walkthrough from Jim, and that language is up on the committee website. And if you want to go ahead and pull it up, it's draft 4.1.
Well, I think we should start with the timeline.
Okay, sounds good. So that's in the same spot, if you want to go there. Okay, whenever you're ready, Jim.
Okay, so for the record, Jim Damery, Ledge Console. We're walking through draft 7 of this timeline, which you've seen many times before. If we go down to the boxes, 2/3 down, where it shows the fiscal years, just to remind the committee that originally the census grant was going to go into effect in fiscal year 21. That's the third box in. And then last year, you delayed that start to fiscal year 22. And now you're delaying it to fiscal year 23. So the first year of the grant will be fiscal year 23 under this bill. And that actually is not technically a census grant. That is a grant that is based on the amount that the school districts have historically received in special ed reimbursement. So that first year, we're taking the average of 3 years worth of reimbursement, fiscal years 18, 19, and 20. We're adding an inflator to it, and that would be the amount that each school district receives the first year. And just to remind the committee, what they'll do with that is in that first year, they'll take that amount of money, well, I won't give examples, but they'll take that amount of money and they'll divide it by their student count. And they'll come out to an amount per student. And that amount per student will be different for every school district in the state, probably because the amount that got reimbursement will differ by school district, and the number of students will differ by school district. So the amount per student will be very different in that first year.
And Jim, just to clarify, so this is ADM, not weighted pupils, it's actual bodies.
Actual bodies, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. ADM count, that's correct. Then if we flip over to the very end of the chart in fiscal year 27, we have a uniform base amount. And what that means is that all districts at that point will be using the same amount of money per student. And it starts in fiscal 27 and it goes forward, and there's no inflator on that after it's set. And that's how there's some cost savings potentially in this act. So between fiscal 23 and fiscal 27, school districts are moving toward that uniform amount. So for example, if in fiscal 23, your student per student number was, let's say 2,000 per student, and let's say that the uniform amount in fiscal year 27 is 3,000 per student, you will move up over 3 years to get to that uniform amount. And if you had the opposite set of facts, you move down to get to that uniform amount. Okay, so those are the transition years happening in fiscal 24, 25, and 26. Is that clear?
I think it's very clear. The one thing I just wanted to ask about is you've also changed the date for the state board rulemaking.
Correct. Yep.
And that's just putting it out a year from where it was after what we did last year.
Yeah, originally this date in Act 173 was November 1, 2019. Last year was changed to August 1, 2020. Now it's being changed to August 1, 21.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Questions on the timeline?
Two further comments, actually, if I could.
Let's let Jim clarify, and then we'll go to Debbie and then Andrew.
Okay, the two further things I wanted to mention, one at the very bottom, the rules that apply to independent schools were to go into effect in fiscal 23 under when Act 173 is passed. Now that's being moved to fiscal 24. So one year extension on that too. And the one thing I wanted to mention as well is that the calculation of the uniform base amount, I realized going through this process, there's a problem with the inflator, how that number is inflated over time. So I fixed that in the draft we're about to go through. Let me explain the fix. That uniform base amount in fiscal year 27, the very last box, it's the average of 3 fiscal years worth of funding, 18, 19, and 20, plus an inflator, okay? So the problem with that is that you have to know what the uniform base amount is at the beginning of fiscal year 24. You have to know that because you're starting to move toward it in fiscal year 24. So you won't know what the inflation rate is in fiscal year 24, 25, or 26. You won't know that information, so you can't really set the uniform base amount without knowing what the inflator is. So what I've done this draft is I've taken the years that we do know what the inflation rate is, I think like fiscal year 21, 22, 23, and I've averaged the inflation rate for those years and used it for the years where we don't know what the inflation rate will be.
Mm-hmm.
Is that clear?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Why don't we move to the language? Oh, I'm sorry, Debbie, and then Andrew.
Thanks. Yeah. So I was just looking at the box that says funding for AOE to provide assistance to supervisory unions in adopting best practices. Will that be extended into FY22? Do we need to appropriate an additional amount of funds, or is that kind of included in AOE's budget?
Well, that has not been done in this draft. The technical assistance that was given by AOE has been, frankly, I think wrongly criticized in terms of what they've given. So you could fund more of it, but I think you want to be more specific as to what they have to do.
Yeah, and I think that was supposed to represent a kind of ongoing cultural shift. And that's why there's no line. Jim hasn't connected it. It's just kind of supposed to be happening. But I think Jim's right. We've all had the sense that it's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we need to deal with it here, but we need to get, when the COVID crisis is over and AOE goes back more or less to normal, we need some kind of firmer commitment from them. And at that time, it may involve more funding, but you know, they're just not accomplishing what's supposed to underlie this whole effort. So let's put that question to the future when we pick up post-emergency. Andy, what was your question?
My question is why the years for the average grant are, 3 fiscal years before the first year of the grant, 18, 19, 20. Why aren't they, 20, 21, 22 or something?
Well, we could move them forward, but then we're getting into an unusual period, right, with COVID. So the reimbursement rates might be not normal anymore. And whatever years you use, they are being inflated. So the years you use is less important because they will be inflated per year after that until you get to the point where it's used.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, that was the same problem during Irene. All the spending exploded. We had infusions of federal cash, and it made it hard. You had to look before Irene and after Irene to figure out what was really going on. Okay, so let's go to the language now. So this is draft 4.1, Jim?
4.1, correct, yep.
And just walk us through and we'll stop you as we need to.
Okay, so just go through the statement of purpose first. The bill proposes, due to the COVID-19 state of emergency, to delay the changes to special education funding from a reimbursement model to a census-based model from July 1, 2021 until July 1, 2022, and to delay the requirement that certain approved independent schools enroll students on an IEP from July 1, 2022 until July 1, 2023.
Mhm.
So section 1, if you flip over to page 2, and you've seen this language numerous times before. We've been through this before. Some of this is technical changes from AOE. So the first change, I don't have lines on my page. My printer doesn't print lines out, so I can't point you to a line. But the first change on page 2 just clarifies that the 3 school years we're using for long-term membership are for the most recent 3 years for which data are available. That's an AOE change.
Jim, just back to Andy's question. So the most recent 3 years for which data is available we do have data that's going to be available, but it won't be reliable because of Corona.
Well, this is for the student count.
Okay,
You're on for the student count. So this is the most recent student count, 3 years worth, an average of that.
okay.
It's the same way you compute ADM.
All right, sounds good.
Except ADM, when you compute ADM, it's an average of 2 years. We use an average of 3 years here.
Okay.
Okay. And then coming down where it says number of paragraph 4, uniform base amount. This goes to that definition together. It says uniform base amount means, this is the amount that you're using in fiscal 27, means an amount determined by dividing an amount equal to the average state appropriation for fiscal years 18, 19, and 20 for special education, and then increased by an inflator, okay? And then divided by long-term membership. So you're basically taking a statewide, how much have you spent on special education? You're dividing it by statewide student count, okay? But we're using the base years of 18, 19, and 20. So it has to be inflated because you have to get from there all the way up to 27. So for the inflator, for each of fiscal years 21, 22, and 23, we'll know what the inflation rate is, so we can use that inflation rate. And then for the years when we don't know what the inflation rate will be, which is fiscal years 24, 25, and 26, we use the average inflation factor for the years we do know, which is fiscal years 21, 22, 23. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Next page. Now we're going into those boxes on the chart we just went through. So page 3 at the top says for fiscal year 23, which is the first year of the census grant, of the grant funding, the amount of the grant for an SU will be the average amount received for fiscal years 18, 19, and 20, and then increased by the inflation factor, okay? That's the first year of grant funding they'll get.
Jim, if I could just ask, so we're into 2020 here, and is that including data from the current situation?
No, because that's fiscal year, so that's 1920.
Okay.
Yeah.
As opposed to 2021.
If you use fiscal year 21, we'd be coming into this period,
Okay,
right? So we're trying to avoid that.
good move.
Okay. Okay, that's that change. And then B says, and this isn't changed, but just to explain how it works. So you get the amount in year 1, 2023, and then it says in B, the amount determined under A, the amount that you got, will be divided by the SU's long-term membership, 3-year average of student count, to determine the base amount of the census grant, which is the amount of the census grant calculated on a per student basis. So this is where you get every SU having a different calculation at this point.
Mhm.
And then at the end, so now for fiscal 27, at the very end of this process, in subsequent fiscal years, the amount of the census grant for SU will be the uniform base amount multiplied by the SU's student count. Okay.
Okay.
And that does not inflate. Once that's done, it does not inflate. And then in the in-between years, for years 24, 25, and 26, the amount of the census grant for an SU should be determined by multiplying the SU's long-term membership by a base amount established under this subdivision. What this language is doing is just moving them from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 27 proportionally to get there. So they're either moving up or down to get to the uniform base amount that's used in fiscal year 27.
Well, that gets somewhat confusing, I have to say. I'm just struggling a little bit with, so for instance, on page 4, we've gone from 2021 to 2023, 2025 to 2027 on lines 5 and 6.
So let's just read that language if we could.
Yeah.
So starting at the top, it says the base amounts for each supervisory union for fiscal years 24, 25, and 26, which are these transitional years, shall move gradually the SU's fiscal year 23 base amount to the fiscal year 27 uniform base amount by prorating the change between the SU's fiscal year 23 base amount and the fiscal year 27 uniform base amount over this 3 fiscal year period.
I get that, but why has it jumped by 2 years rather than 1 year?
Oh, because he moved out the start date by 2 years, right?
You mean because we delayed a year last year and we're delaying another year?
Yeah. So
Okay.
moving everything forward by 2 years.
Okay, I thought we were changing language where we had moved it 1 year last year. So now this year there would only be a 1 year
No,
move.
because these changes should have been made last year. These up by a year, but they weren't made.
Right,
So-
because the collapse of the miscellaneous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But well, I'm not sure exactly why. But I wasn't here for that part, but whoever helped with that didn't understand how this all worked. So we're making it up now.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
And then, so that's that section. Any questions on that?
No, I don't see any.
Okay. Okay. Next section are this just technical changes from the AOE.
Jim? Sorry, Ruth has a question.
Oh, yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. This may be just an editing question, but in that section that you just read on lines 2, for example, shall move gradually the supervisory union's fiscal year base amount to. Aren't there some words missing there? Isn't there a to missing or something? The phrasing is really awkward.
We needed Sarah Ingram, our English professor, to help us
Yeah,
here.
no, it's actually right. I mean, I can see, yeah.
it reads okay to
Gradually
me
move the supervisory union's fiscal year
too.
amount to
Yeah.
a different uniform base amount by prorating the change. It's right.
Okay. It just seems like it's missing words.
I read it a couple of times. I think it's not the smoothest construction, but I think it's grammatical.
Okay. I trust you too. And Jim, of course.
I think the only people who have to understand this is you guys and AOE. So,
Okay,
okay. So section 2 are just changes from AOE. We've been through these before, but because we're moving from a reimbursement to a grant system, we want to get rid of the word expenditures and costs. Those are terms usually used more with reimbursement. So you're moving to the words funding, basically, for funds.
okay.
So that's a change there. Section 3 on page 5. This is the section again, changes by AOE. Technical changes, I believe. There's a 2% bucket that the secretary can use for unusual circumstances. And that 2% bucket under this language is now tied to the amount of the census grant. So it's tied to a different source, if you will, because we're moving to census grant as opposed to reimbursement.
And Jim, have we voted on that language before?
On this language?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so this is new from AOE?
Well, it's new. It came in last year. We went through it last. I think you wrote it on last year because I think you moved this last year.
Okay, that
this
was
is
my
all last
question
year.
was, okay, and what was it tied to before?
I think it's here. It's where it's crossed out. So it's up to 2% of the funds appropriated for special education.
So that would be the money to reimburse what had already been spent.
yeah. And now they're moving it to 2% of the census grant.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Section 4 is okay. So section 4 came up in House Education. There's requests that the advisory group have a bit more life to it now that these days are being moved out. The
Mhm.
advisory group is under this language, it was going to cease to exist on June 30, 22. That would move to June 30, 23, 1 year.
Yep.
And then the next part about reimbursement, it is allowing them to have up to 12 meetings per year as opposed to 8 because they ran out of meetings in the past. So it allows them to be compensated for 12 meetings per year, and that will increase the appropriation from 5,300 approximately to 9,000.
Yeah, this is gonna add at least 2 weeks, if not a month, to the passage of this bill, because it's gonna have to go through our appropes, their appropes, and they're working very slowly these days. This isn't super time sensitive, so I don't think it's really, you know, it's not a super emergency that it be changed now rather than a month from now. But just so we are expecting that delay. Does anybody have a problem with extending the life of the advisory panel? Okay, I think they've done very good work, you know, and on the rulemaking, they were very helpful, so I'm fine with it. It's a small amount of money. Okay, keep going, Jim.
Okay, so section 5 extends rulemaking. So last year you changed 2 dates last year. You pushed out the grant funding by 1 year and you moved rulemaking by 1 year. This moves it by an additional year. So it's moving, you moved last year to August 1, 2020. Now it's being moved to August 1, 2021.
Okay,
Okay. And then section 6, again, just moving these dates forward by 2 years. You can see the 2-year changes here in section 6. And the IDA references something that came from AOE as technical change.
mhm,
Section 7, you may recall that 173 gave some leeway under the current state board rules to allow teachers to teach students who struggle more as a group rather than just students on IEP. That's being moved out to 2 years as well. So that relief will remain in place for 2 more years. Section 8 is the requirement for, okay, so now we're moving away from the census grant and into the approved independent school part of 173.
yeah,
And so there was a requirement that the state board initiate rulemaking there's a concern about getting approval by independent schools for providing services for various categories of disabilities and how long that takes. So this language says on or before June 30, 2021, but moving by 2 years, the State Board of Education shall review its rules for approving independent schools in specific special education categories and initiate rulemaking to update its rules to simplify and expedite the approval process. That's been moved by 2 years.
Okay, so Jim, I'm just trying to clarify, this is new language.
It's old
Yes.
language, except for the date change.
I see, okay, so what I'm getting at is the independent school folks, this is part of the agreement that we made at the end of the 173 bill writing process. Do you remember that? Nicole Mace, Patty Comline, representing their various people, came up with a compromise, which we put into 173. So this keeps that in place, just changes the date.
Yeah, and the concern, what this addresses is the concern that if the approved independent schools are going to be required to take on special education students, it takes too much time to get approved for that category of disability.
Yeah,
So they're trying to find a way to speed that up.
okay,
Okay.
okay.
And then section 9 is new
Jim,
language.
Jim,
It comes from
Jim.
John Carroll.
Just one
Sure.
second. Just Debbie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was trying to understand the why it's gone from November 1st to June 30th.
It really ties into the date in section 9, which we're about to come to. It was a request by John Carroll
Okay,
for that date. But let me come back to that just in 1 minute if I could.
Okay,
Okay.
So section 9 does a couple of things in regard to state board rules. Both of these are requested by John Carroll. First, they
Oh,
want
Jim.
time.
I'm sorry, this was the section I was asking my question about.
Okay.
So I thought we were talking about section 9 already. But what I'm wondering is, this update to State Board of Education rules, is that language that we have vetted through the stakeholders, or is this something that's come straight from the state board?
Straight from the state board.
Okay, so we will need to have the stakeholder groups take a look at it to make sure that, or why don't you explain what it does and we'll see
Okay.
how.
So the first in 9A, let me go back. 173 did not have a date by which the state board had to approve rules for the independent schools. Didn't have a date. You had to do that, but you didn't say when. You did say when up in section 8 on this one piece that deals with special education categories. But there's a wholesale requirement, need to update the rules for independent schools to comply with your statute. There's no general provision in 172 that did that. 9A does that. 9A says that there's a date now by which the state board has to initiate rulemaking to implement Act 173, okay, for independent schools.
And the board testified that, or if it comes from the board, I guess that speaks for itself, but they would have to begin this work very quickly.
Well, they have to initiate rulemaking on or before June 30, 2021. So they have a
Okay.
whole year.
Okay,
Because these rules don't come into place now until fiscal 24 in terms
Okay.
of the new requirements. So that's why 9A is there. That's new. Going back up to 8, there was a little piece of rulemaking due by November 1, and we want to align those dates so that they're all being done by initiated on June 3rd, by June 30 of 21.
okay, so this is just changing dates.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
There was no date. 9A is new. There was no date generally for rulemaking in this area. That is new. And then the second issue is in B, they have done rules. They've begun the rulemaking process for the census grant funding. Okay, so they've begun that process, and they're in the public comment period right now. But that public comment period will run out in the next few months. And John doesn't want it to run out during the COVID emergency. He wants more time for people to be able to comment on the rules.
Mhm.
This is extending the comment period on those rules until the end of this year, and then adjusting the other Administrative Procedure Act process accordingly.
Debbie?
I think so. I know that in that other legislation we were working on, we changed, you do duties between the state board and the AOE. So these are all, but these are consistent with how we changed.
Yeah, they retained the special ed category of rulemaking.
Yeah.
Okay, I just
So-
thought it was worth asking.
And just a note for the committee, I'm still talking with the pro tem about a desire to pass, to make sure we get past the changes we made in statewide healthcare bargaining and the changes we made on the state board. He's given me every indication that there's going to be an opportunity before we adjourn Sina DA that we'll be able to move those. So fingers crossed that that work will still go forward this year. So,
And then lastly, section 10, which is over on the top of the next page, changes the effective dates of Act 173. So B changes, so section 5 will take effect on July 1, 2022. That's how we're moving that out by another year. And then sections 20A through 21, that's the independent school rules. That's being moved out by a year to 23. That's it.
So on the actual effective date, why not have it all take effect on passage?
Because one through 3 are the grant funding changes that won't take effect until they can. If you did that, you'd be moving to census grant funding today, or right. Those sections 1 through 3 are the ones that put in census grant funding, which don't take effect until July 1, 2022. We're still under reimbursement for a couple of years, so.
I guess, but don't they use their own discrete dates in those sections, right? So
No, you're not changing that law until July 1, 2022.
okay,
So all that law doesn't change because you're still under the reimbursement system, current law, until you get there. So you can't have this go effective now or.
right. I was just thinking that in those early sections, those changes each have a date attached to them. So I was wondering why.
Those dates are all after July 1, 2022. They're all phasing in.
No, I understand that, but why, since they all have a date attached to them that's after passage, why we couldn't just have it all go into effect and then all those dates kick in whenever the date is?
Because the language that we're looking at here replaces the entire chapter on special education.
Okay,
Right.
just, it's fine with me. I just was trying to understand what the triggering was necessary for.
The chapter on special education today is all about reimbursement, right? So if you try to layer it, you couldn't really layer it because there's two different systems.
Yeah.
So it's
Okay.
all got to switch over at one point.
Okay, well, questions for Jim about any of that language, beginning to end? Okay, I don't have any other questions. My only question had to do with the language from the state board, but that is just a prose version of changing dates. So,
Yeah.
so let's see. And I also don't have any qualms about the independent school part of it. So does anybody have an objection to voting this out? Okay, do we still have Jim? No, we lost Jim.
Oh, Jim McNeil.
Yeah, he had a meeting at 2:30. So we will just reluctantly vote without him. Corey, I believe you're all set up to call the vote, right? Right.
Would you
Okay,
like a
so-
motion?
So I would entertain a motion for this.
So I move that we approve draft 4.1 of this committee bill and recommend it to the full Senate.
So Senator Ingram has moved that we move draft 4.1 favorably. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none, the clerk will call the roll.
He's muted.
You're muted, Senator Parent.
Sorry. Senator Hardy,
Aye.
Senator Ingram,
Aye.
Senator McNeil. Senator Parent, yes. Senator Perchlik.
Yes.
Senator Baruth.
Yes.
Senator McNeil. Absent. Pass 501.
Okay, great. So,
Jeannie, I'll scan this and get it over to you. I don't have a scanner here, but I'll get it over tonight.
thanks, Corey. And I will report this and try to make it as brief as possible. I will present it as a series of confusing date changes, and then move on.
That's a good idea.
So just a note on where we are with the House in terms of this. They had a walkthrough with Jim. They suggested at least one change. I have checked in with Kate Webb. So as far as I know, we are locked and loaded to have this go through the Senate to the House. They concur, and I believe our work is done. So not so fortunate on the default budget language. That does not have their agreement, so that will unfortunately idle off to one side. And as far as I'm concerned, we won't pick it up. They, as you remember, they were pushing for something more like a 4% inflator on the language, which I have told them was a non-starter for us. I made the argument that our language was a much better outcome for these districts if it kicked in than what's in law. Chairperson Webb agreed with that, but still would not agree to our solution. So we'll put that off to one side. Corey and then Andrew.
Does she get the finance? So the part I've got friends on the House committee, and what worries me as we enter the summer with our budget issue is I don't think the House committee really understands the financial situation we're in with education. And I mean, even when we were on finance last week, it was very clear that the Senate didn't have an appetite for a 26-cent tax increase, but I'm not sure the House is quite there. And I think, to me, this is just evident that level funding seems like a fair compromise where we are. And
yeah,
I just want to, I don't know, just, and it's hard for you to speak to, but I worry that they just don't get the problem.
Well, I look, the House committee is composed of very smart people. I think they understand the nature of the difficulties we're in, but they are, for reasons that I've never been able to figure out, they're very much in sync always with the superintendents and Jeff Francis. So if you remember, Ruth and Debbie will remember this, the lead bill, the problem we had was that Jeff was very silent in our committee and then went over to the House and bid them up in terms of dollar amounts to a point where we couldn't follow them, and we wound up in a contentious 3-week conference with them. So, what I've said to Jeff is, you're so influential and successful that you've now gotten your districts nothing, no change in the law. So I imagine at a certain point, they will see what we've done as you say, as a good compromise. If they don't, then current statute will have to suffice, and we can't make them go along. Andrew?
Yeah, on that point, I had talked to one of our districts that doesn't have a budget and is worried about this and mentions this issue with the House not agreeing to our language. That resulted in me getting a call from a member of Ways and Means that said that the Ways and Means Committee is working with the Education Committee on this issue. So they are talking about the larger economic issues the state is facing. Yeah. But the way it was portrayed to me is that they are working on, I don't know if I want to call it a counter proposal, but they're working on a proposal that would allow another option. They specifically are concerned about those districts that, for no fault of their own, it wasn't that the voter said no, but they just never got a vote out, that they are working on a proposal. They think those districts should get treated differently than the districts that actually had a no vote. So I was told they're going to be working on kind of our language at 100%, but then a different track for these districts that never got to have a vote.
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing that because, you know, you're still saying we're going to skip the voters.
Right.
And actually Jeff Francis's proposal, as I told you last time, was really to skip the voters, which was to, as he described it to me initially, was to give failed budgets another chance and just put them into law, which, you know, I thought was just really ill-advised. I understand the idea that in this environment, voters will be skittish, but, you know, you could say the same thing about a presidential election. If there's an event that happens, it changes how people vote. That's part of the voting process. There's an atmosphere in which people vote. So to say we think the atmosphere will prejudice the vote, and so we're going to take away the democratic process, I just have a very hard time with that.
And I wasn't
offering
weighing in. I was just letting you know what they were coming.
No, and Kate had mentioned that as well. You know, I was pretty clear with her that I think this is what we can do. So we'll just, you know, continue to wait on them. So committee, it's just about 2:45, which is good timing. I had hoped to have 15 minutes or maybe a little more for us to talk as a committee about what we would work on next. We've kind of gone as far as we can with the two pieces we had queued up. I have something I want to drop as a possibility. I know Ruth had a couple of things she wanted to talk about. We got into Andrew's concerns on continuity of education last time. So let me just quickly go to Andrew. Andrew, following last Tuesday's testimony, is there anything you want us to follow up on, or did that speak to your concern?
Yeah, no, that was good. And I learned through the process of setting that up that the union and the teachers are having a good conversation with AOE on how to proceed and how to do appropriate changes to the plans. I felt good about it.
Okay, I see Corey, but let me go to Ruth next. So Ruth, am I right that the driver's ed concern you had raised is tabled by the state board for now?
Yeah, it is. Wait, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm so paranoid about my audio today, but yeah, and I emailed a few of you on the issue, but just, I'm not sure I brought Corey in, so apologies, Corey, but there was a proposal to waive a state board of education rule that requires student drivers to have certified driver's education instruction by a certified driver's ed instructor. And they were going to waive that rule because of concerns about whether or not that could happen. And I raised concerns about it because I have heard from a bunch of driver's ed teachers about it, and they were concerned about the safety implications. Vermont has one of the best safety records because we have that requirement. And the driver's education teachers were not consulted before this proposal went out. And I have 3 teenagers, one of whom is slated to take driver's ed this summer. So it was near and dear to my personal heart. And so I raised some concerns about the process and actually worked with Andrew because AOT or DMV was somewhat involved. It is a state board of education rule. But so the long story short, yesterday state board met and they ended up tabling the proposal to waive this rule, at least until they can get some feedback from driver's education teachers and local school districts. And so at least for now, my concerns are tabled as well. And I just want to make sure that if we are going to be waiving rules, we're going through a good process to do so and taking into consideration safety and other considerations and making sure we're checking with everyone. I don't know where that noise is coming from. It's not from my house.
Somebody's got a pooch.
Not my dog.
My father-in-law, he's here for the day. Sorry,
Okay,
Sorry.
So that was my first concern, and hopefully it will be taken care of, or has been taken care of. And then the second thing, I was talking last week with Brad James and asking him about transportation aid. And I had heard that, so transportation aid is based on a provision, and Jim, you can weigh in obviously on this one, that says that it's based on the transportation of students. And since this year they're using buses to transport food, not students, there was a question of whether or not all the transportation costs for this year would count for the calculation of aid. And there's actually a 2-year lag. So it would be FY20 expenses that would be used for FY22 aid, and whether or not in 2 years the expenses of transporting food rather than kids, and this is state aid, not federal aid, would count. And I've heard varying explanations. Somebody told me that the secretary was going to waive this rule, but it's not a rule. It's actually, it's in statute. And so Brad, when I talked to him a week ago, he thought we needed to take action to at least change that temporarily to make sure school districts could count these costs, transportation costs for transporting food in their transportation aid. So I just wanted clarification. I don't know if Jim can clarify or if we need to get the secretary in to definitely clarify, but if this is the fix we might need to make, I want to get on it. So those are the two things I had.
okay, Jim, thoughts on that? Do you have thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, I talked to Brad about that a while ago. He thought this could wait because there's a 2-year lag, but it could be taken care of more quickly if you chose to.
Well, I'm going to suggest a different, I think we should take care of it. I'm going to suggest a different route than our committee, because honestly, working with the House is so difficult and time consuming, and this is such an obvious thing. So I'm going to talk to Jane about just fixing it in the budget. It would be very simple for her to drop it in. So Jim, if you could write up I assume it's like a 1-line fix with maybe a little notation about the emergency. And then I'll give Jane a heads up and give it to Stephanie. And I think that's the easiest way to do it. Then we won't have to put out a whole bill or try to put it into a miscellaneous format.
Okay, yep.
Okay, and then Corey, you were raising your hand earlier.
I just wanted to chime in on Andy's thing, and it might be something we have to work on next year, but I do think the lessons learned from this can actually give us a unique position to address other concerns we have in Vermont with snow days and other things. I think we shouldn't look at, the future of education with regards to, learning at home or learning through computers and just stop it with this pandemic. I think there will be benefits on looking at this longer term and how we can implement it so that it's more a regular part of how we educate our kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we can, when we're back to normal hearing status, we can, have a couple of days of hearings as we go forward. It's a little harder now, but so let me run an idea out and Ruth can tell me if anybody's working on this. It's a childcare idea. And it comes from a constituent that Debbie and I share. And he's written me a couple of times and he's very worked up about it. And as I got into it, I realized a little more of what he's dealing with. So he has 2 kids who are in daycare. His daycare operation, even though, as I understand it, Ruth, the state had suggested that daycares charge parents half the cost, the state would pick up half, and then they reserve their spot. And what their daycare has done is to say, we would prefer if you pay the whole thing. But if you can't financially afford it, then it's okay to pay half and the state will pay half. And so they feel as though they're being put in this ethical dilemma of they can afford it technically, but then they're paying for 2 kids, which together is like $2,500 a month, and not getting childcare because their child is now at home. So they're basically paying $2,500 a month, getting no service. The only thing they're getting out of it is preserving their spot. So even if their daycare wasn't doing something like that, even if it was a more straightforward 50-50, they would still be paying $1,250 a month for no service just to hold their slot. Now, I get that the administration, it was a compromise so that they could preserve the healthcare or the childcare system, so that when we're back up and running, those people are all there. The operations haven't gone out of business. So it makes sense to me that the state reluctantly came to this situation. But what he asked was, can't we get some credit for having helped the state out in its time of need? So he's suggesting a tax credit going forward that maybe a year down the road, they would be able to provide receipts that they paid during this time when there was no service provided them to keep the operation afloat. So as a mark of its gratitude, the state wouldn't reimburse the whole thing, but they would provide some tax credit. Thoughts on that? Let me go to Ruth first because she's been working on this area.
Yeah, Phil, this is an area that I have had concerns with from the beginning and have brought up several times with CDD. And I want to say, first off, I know everybody was working in crisis mode and doing the best they could, but the design of this child care stabilization program is problematic for a number of reasons. And I think this is one of the primary reasons. So a child care program should not be asking for 100% from their families if they are getting the state's reimbursement child care stabilization program payments. So if they are asking for 100% and also filing for those child care stabilization payments, then they are not following the rules of the program, and that's not okay. The most they are allowed to be asking for from parents is 50% in order to get the stabilization payments, or at least that's my understanding. And one of the issues has been that the rules have changed on this program. There was a period where they were changing pretty much every day. So, but the last time I had this clarified and I checked the rules, it was they could ask for 50% from parents in order to get these stabilization program payments. If they were just waiving the ability to get those payments at all from the state, they could do whatever they want. Most child care providers are private businesses, and so what to do outside of a regular state program. But you point to one of the big problems is that for parents who can't pay the 50%, they actually lose their spot in the child care program, and their kids put on essentially a super long waiting list. For those parents who can pay for it, they have to pay for childcare they're not getting, which can be really, really expensive. So it actually crunches parents in the middle, because on the lower end, they're getting the subsidy payments, and on the higher end, they can afford the payments, but somebody's in the middle can't afford it and doesn't get the subsidy. So it's a really problematic situation. And this is the first I'd heard of a situation like this where they're really asking them to pay 100%. In terms of the tax credit, I guess I would say it's a really interesting idea. I don't know how we would necessarily pay for it, but maybe in the long run we could. The one thing is that for the people child care payments are already pre-tax or can be pre-tax. So if you do, one of those healthcare, payment program, I'm blanking on the name.
Yeah,
Andy's nodding.
I know what
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're already pre-tax payments. So you're not taxed on the income you pay for childcare or healthcare costs in a lot of cases. So I don't know how we would interact with that. That would be really a question for Anne and the Finance Committee. But I I do think that there are families who have been really disadvantaged by the way that this program has been set up. And it's concerning to me, and I've raised the concern a number of times.
Okay, so it sounds like there's the, it sounds like there's a couple of related issues. One is that this daycare is asking for something that's not in the guidelines, so we can look into that. The other is, even if they were doing the 50-50 split, is there a possibility of offering a tax credit down the road or some other form of compensation? So looking forward to next week, I'm thinking maybe Tuesday, we might try to schedule, or it might take a little more time than that. Maybe Thursday, we would have a hearing on this. That would give Ruth and I a chance. Ruth could dig up some witness names. I could go back to the constituent. I want to make sure that he's okay with going public, because he may be worried about jeopardizing their relationship with his daycare. I would be if it was my two kids. So I will look into that. I'll also give the daycare a call and just ask them about their policy. So if we think about a week from today for that hearing, and Ruth, if you want to think about it and then maybe send me an email with some potential names and I'll pass those on to Jeannie.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
Phil,
Yeah.
just one second. Maybe we should just have a phone conversation offline about it too.
Sounds good.
That would be great.
Okay, anything else anybody wants to bring up? That gives us one new thing to look into. Ruth, you're muted, Ruth.
Sorry, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is if you have a sense yet of what our role as the Ed Committee might be in the whole Vermont State College situation.
So, Jeb pulled back his 3-campus closure plan, but all of the financial drivers are still in place. They're still, according to Jeb, looking at not being able to meet payroll come June. So I understand in talking with leadership and the Appropriations Committee that they are fully open to working out a bridge budget up to $25 million with the understanding that they want to, make sure that there are whatever belt tightening can be done now that all of that is going on, even as we launch a larger discussion. So the question is, what will that larger discussion look like? I personally am not convinced that putting together a grand stakeholder committee of 25 or 30 people is what we need at this point. That seems to me like something you do if you have 5 years to decide. You start with 30 people, then you go down to a legislative committee, then you go down to the committees of jurisdiction, and then you write a bill or however you want to enact it. It seems we need to move much more quickly than that. So what I'm going to recommend to Tim is that we have a much smaller group that's basically derived from committees of jurisdiction, and that those committees of jurisdiction figure out who might professionally be asked to step in and develop another plan in conjunction with that group. So in other words, we don't look for a legislative group that will do financial analysis, do number crunching, a financial and higher ed expertise in the legislature so much. We look for a group that could supervise professionals to do that on a very short time frame. So this is the idea that I'm thinking of. We would take the Education Committee, the Appropriations Committee, and the Institutions Committee, because if you remember, the issue breaks down to educational delivery at the campuses and then what happens to the campuses if they're shut down. So I think Joe's committee, Jane's committee, and our committee are really the three, and economic development. So 4 committees. If each committee contributed 1 or 2 people, that's plenty for a Senate version. My worry, though, is that we would then bring in an equivalent amount from the House and an equivalent amount from the administration, and you're back up to 15 or 20 people. So I'm gonna be working with Tim. He will be continuing talks with Mitzi and the governor. As soon as something looks as though it's shaking out, I will be back to everybody. And that's about all I have on it for now. Okay, so we're just over 3 o'clock. Good work today, and I'll be in touch with Ruth about, maybe not today, Ruth, but between now and the weekend, we'll talk about that childcare piece. And then
Yeah.
committee, if there's anything else that comes up from your constituents or any direction, just let me know. Otherwise, we'll move on this one next week, and we'll look to pass this 173 piece, if not at our next Senate meeting, then the one after that. Okay, thanks very much. And Jeannie, if you can just hang on the line for a second with me. Okay, Jeannie? Yes, I
Should I
believe.
stop the live stream now?
Yeah, you
Senator?
can go ahead and stop the live stream, and